All right, welcome to the conversation. So what actually happened in Venezuela? Why did it fall apart? And can we have a new relationship with Venezuela, especially because of the war in Ukraine? We're gonna try to answer all of that with our next guest, William Neuman. He's the author of Things Are Never So Bad They Can't Get Worse, Inside the Collapse of Venezuela. Bit depressing as a title, but I hear you. William, welcome to the program.
Hi, Jake. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. All right, so in order to understand what's happening today, we got to go back. So I've heard over and over again that Venezuela fell apart because it's a socialist country, and that's what the problem was. Is that true?
No, that's really not true at all. What happened in Venezuela was populism, not socialism. It doesn't matter how many times the leader puts on a red T-shirt and calls himself a socialist. That doesn't make somebody a socialist. Venezuela's always been a capitalist country. It has a very high degree of government involvement in the economy because the government controls the oil industry, which is the biggest part of the economy. But it's always been a market economy. Chavez, essentially socialism for Chavez and for Maduro after him was a form of branding, which they used to build up their support in the population and to stay in power. And what you have in Venezuela is essentially the same kind of populism that we've seen in the United States recently. And it was really Chavez who was a pioneer in a lot of this and wrote what has become in this country the Republican playbook, which is polarize, mine social divisions, capture the judiciary, change the rules of the elections to benefit yourself, and that's essentially, what's happened there.
So, William, that's really interesting because I never quite thought about it this way. So I know I'll talk of like socialism and that's why I know that's garbage, of course, right? And so, and I kind of like the word populism. So I want to have a conversation with you about that too, and what you mean by it, as opposed to what I mean by it. But it sounds like Hugo Chavez initially saw that what was popular in Latin America and Venezuela in particular is the idea of socialism, because historically, I'm guessing here, you tell me if I'm right or wrong. Historically, that has been more of a populist movement would go towards socialism in Latin America because they were constantly fighting off American power and they're incredibly wealthy. And so it's a more populist brand in Latin America. Whereas the more populist brand in America is the jackbooted thugs of the government, and the Republicans are going to look out for you, the individual, and protect your freedom, etc. So is that a fair analogy, or do I misunderstand it?
Approximately. I mean, you've had both right-wing and left-wing populisms in Latin America. Of the Latin American left is anti-imperialism vis-a-vis the United States. And so that's something that Chavez really rode and was a very strong part of his message and Maduro's message. I mean, it's ironic now because Maduro calls himself the great anti-imperialist, and Maduro has been one of the biggest cheerleaders worldwide for Putin in his invasion of Ukraine. So you have the so-called leftist anti-imperialist in Latin America supporting the bigger country invading the smaller country.
Well, that irony, unfortunately, is everywhere now. There are a lot of people that are in America pretending to be on the left who are supporting Putin, and they're like, "Oh, we're doing it because of anti-imperialism." I'm like, I think you might misunderstand the word. Yeah. Okay, and by that, of course, they mean just anti-America. And so, and I'm on the left, and the overwhelming majority of folks on the left aren't anti-American. That's insane, right? But unfortunately, some people these days actually get paid for that. And so, anyway, corruption all around, not just in Venezuela, but here as well. But back to Venezuela. So, you know, when we talk about socialism, that's another word that's completely misunderstood, and no one really even knows what socialism means. Does it mean Denmark? Does it mean Venezuela? Does it mean China, right? Which are all very different economies. Although Venezuela and Denmark maybe not so different. Partly based on what you're saying. But was there any centralized decision making in Venezuela in the government as you would find in China today? Or is it just the oil?
There was never a centralized economy in Venezuela. Venezuela has always had a market economy. I mean, a lot of what you have seen in Venezuela over the last bunch of years under Chavez and Maduro is sort of a more old-fashioned Latin American form of state-centered economics, which you had in, it was a fad up through the 1970s in a lot of these countries, in Mexico and plenty of other countries, where the government would take over certain industries or control or regulate very heavily certain parts of the economy. But that didn't make those countries socialist countries. It was just the idea that more public participation was the better way to do these things. And then by the end of the 70s, everything reversed, or into the 80s, and you had the opposite. You had privatization. These governments privatized all the companies that they had either created or taken over. And in Venezuela, you just sort of had a continuation of that, partly because that's how Venezuelans think of government, because in Venezuela, the government is the oil industry, and the oil industry is the only game in town, and that's where all the money comes from. And so it's very natural in Venezuela, regardless almost of what party you're in, to think of a heavy government participation in the economy.
So William, what
doesn't make it socialist?
Got you. So what actually went wrong? What did Hugo Chavez do and then Maduro continue that seemed to have destroyed the Venezuelan economy? And as you write, even though they're sitting on a mountain of oil and tons of incredibly valuable natural resources, you almost can't screw it up, but they did. So what did they do wrong?
Well, a lot of things went wrong there. When I was working on the book and I was trying to figure out how to describe it, I sort of got to this point where I came up with a very simple narrative, which was it rained money, they spent it all, stole some of it, wasted some of it, and then it stopped raining and people went hungry. I mean, essentially, Chavez was very fortunate because for a good part of Chavez's presidency, and he became president in 1999 and was president until 2013 when he died, and Maduro took over, the price of oil was rising. And when Chavez comes to office, the price of Venezuelan oil was about $8 a barrel, and ultimately went up to $120 a barrel. And people like to say that Chavez had charisma, but what Chavez really had was oil at $100 a barrel, and that buys a lot of charisma. And so the country was just flooded with money. It just filled up with money, and they spent it, and they spent some of it on social programs. They built houses and apartment buildings with some of it. A tremendous amount was stolen, a tremendous amount was wasted all over the country. There's hospitals that are half built, never finished, schools, you name it, bridges that never got finished. This is a tremendous waste of resources. I mean, you look at all the money that came into that country, and if that government had been somewhat efficient, the country would be much better today. And essentially, the other thing is they saved nothing. They had billions and billions come in. They didn't save essentially a penny. And so then all of a sudden, Chavez dies in 2013, and in 2014, the price of oil starts to go down. And by early 2015, it had gotten down to $30 a barrel. And so they essentially ran out of money, and they hadn't saved any. And at that point, Maduro sort of takes a bunch of bad decisions in terms of how to run the economy, and it just keeps getting worse and worse, and enters this crisis.
And how did they?
Essentially because.
Yeah. So I get that part. But how did they wind up starting to slowly take apart democracy?
Okay, well, that's when we get to Chavez was one of the pioneers in what we've seen worldwide now, which is these authoritarian figures, these charismatic figures who come in and use democracy, use elections to get into office, to gain power. And then once they're there, they start to dismantle all those checks and balances and elements of democracy that they can stay in power. And that's essentially what Chavez did. And Chavez was brilliant at mining polarization. I mean, it's a real, I like to say that Venezuela is a lesson for the United States, a cautionary tale for the United States. The countries are very different, but you can watch what happens when a country becomes deeply polarized politically and the people in power decide to use that polarization and division to stay in power. And that's one of the classic elements of populism, where the leader comes in and he says, I represent the people, I am the people, but the people is only part of the people, which are the people who are willing to support him.
Yeah, so in Venezuela, what form did that take? So in America, that largely takes a racial form, a little bit of religious form. In Venezuela, how did they galvanize this? But galvanize their side, but split the country.
Well, those divisions were there to begin with, but then the leader comes in and really mines them and exacerbates them or emphasizes them. In Venezuela, it was rich versus poor. Or poor versus rich from the Chavista perspective. And that's where the socialist branding or the socialist narrative comes in handy for Chavez. And so, I mean, that's the simple and that's the simple way to look at it. It was a class difference.
So that's really interesting because in America, since the so-called populists, the fake populists, in my opinion, from the right wing, don't have the ability to use economic populism because they represent the rich, and there's just not enough votes in the rich. They have to use religion and race in order to do their populism. But if you were coming at it from the left, I suppose, economic populism would be the logical way to rally people.
Don't you think that under Trump, a lot of what we saw was a kind of economic populism, because you had this great big segment of the population that felt left out by globalization. And so, there was a lot of economic populism going on there. And when I say that it was that he mined the class divisions, I mean, obviously there was horrible problems with poverty in Venezuela. The problem is now that it's worse today. In other words, what happens there's been a lot of cases of economic populism in Venezuela over the last 60, 70 years. And in every single one, these governments come in and they say, oh, we're gonna make the life better for the poor. And after that populist episode, ultimately it crashes and the poor are worse off than when they started. And in the case of Venezuela, I just think there's this horrible cynicism because there was no sustainable form of social programs ever put into place. Yeah. Everything they did was for popularity and to stay in power. And it was simply not, it wasn't built to last.
So, William, we're wildly out of time, but I nonetheless, I have to ask you a couple more things. So the populism doesn't necessarily have to be married to authoritarianism. Right, so that's why that would be my defense of populism and economic populism overall. So couldn't you argue that in Uruguay they did economic populism without the authoritarian streak, and it actually worked pretty well?
Well, when are we talking about it in Uruguay?
The previous president, his name escapes me.
Under Pepe Mujica?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think that I would call that populism. I would call that, a moderate form of social welfare-based government, which isn't the same as populism.
Yeah, okay, we're splitting hairs on the definition, I think, but I don't think that it has to be attached to authoritarianism. And if it is, I get that authoritarians will use it for their own benefit, as they did in Venezuela. It's almost a perfect case for it. But I think you could do real economic populism without being evil.
Well, I think that a lot of people, a lot of these episodes start out with good intentions.
Yeah, well, every accumulation of power, uses some proxy to get that power, whether it's religious, racial, economic, or otherwise. Then the question is, do they mean it? And 9 out of 10 times they don't mean it because they're trying to attain power, right? But it is certainly possible that 1 out of 10 times they would mean it. And I would give FDR as another example. I would argue he was an economic populist, and he actually did deliver.
Oh, well, I think we're running into semantic problems here, because in Latin America, the history of populism tends to have very specific, especially economic populism, has very specific elements. And it often has to do with excessive government spending that doesn't match with government income through taxes or other means, and inevitably leads to these sort of imbalances in the economy that crash.
Yeah. So okay, yeah, that is, I suspected it's partly a definitional issue. All right, super last thing. What do you think? Are we going to cut a deal with Venezuela to start bring their oil back in to replace the Russian oil? I mean, there'd be some decent irony there, but I would be in favor of it because I think the sanctions are hurting the actual people of Venezuela. So thoughts on that?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. The short version is that the U.S. Starting under Trump since Trump, the U.S. hasn't had a Venezuela foreign policy. Trump had a Florida election strategy that utilized Venezuela. And then Biden comes into office and he's basically stuck with the trap that Trump left him, where softening any of the measures, and especially the sanctions taken against Venezuela, have this very intense political backlash. And it was very effective for the Republicans in 2020, where Trump won the state and they knocked off a couple of Democratic Congress people. And so Biden has been very wary about doing anything with Venezuela. This, when we saw this trip to Venezuela to meet with Maduro the other day, that was surprising, and that's because I think there was some feeling that maybe the whole Ukraine thing had reshuffled the equation, but the blowback they got was intense. And I would expect that they try to do something where they tweak the sanctions to let a company like Chevron, which is already doing business in a small way in Venezuela, expand what it does, and that will potentially bring in some oil from Venezuela for the first time in a few years. And the longer conversation is, why do we have an oil embargo against Venezuela? And there's plenty to say about that. And essentially, that was John Bolton on the spur of the moment saying, let's hit them with everything we got. And they put in the oil sanction without considering all of the implications, including the social cost in Venezuela to all the ordinary people who suffered because of the impact on the economy.
Color me surprised that John Bolton screwed up something. All right, super last thing. Maduro, would he take the deal? Is he a practical guy who thinks, yeah, Russia supported me this whole time, but what do I care? I'm gonna get more money from America.
There's a lot of moving pieces there, but one of the things is that Venezuela, to get around the US sanctions, has had to sell its oil to China at a discount, and it doesn't sell to the big Chinese government oil companies. It sells at these little, what they call sort of teapot refineries in China. And with the sanctions against Russia, now all the Russian oil, which is way more than the Venezuela oil, is going to be going to those same buyers of oil. And they're much more likely to try and do business with the Russians than the Venezuelans. So it may be that Maduro has a tremendous incentive to sell oil to the United States.
Super.
Because he may not have, his market may be disappearing.
I didn't know that either. That's a great point. All right, William Neuman, author of Things Are Never So Bad They Can't Get Worse, Inside the Collapse of Venezuela. William, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.